This is Keith Lipscomb from ESPN, and if you want to maximize your potential for success, then I recommend subscribing to the Success is a Choice podcast.
Providing insights to help you grow your business, improve yourself, and add value to those around you. You're listening to the Success is a Choice podcast, where you get a peek into the lives of industry leaders as they share their stories with you.
Welcome to the Success is a Choice podcast. I'm your host, Jamy Bechler. And with the 2018 NFL season just mere days away, we thought it would be appropriate to have one of the top fantasy football experts on the show. But Drew Dinkmeyer has a resume that includes much more than just his high-stakes daily fantasy sports success. Yes, he has won $1 million in one night in one tournament alone, but he has quite the background. He founded the popular DailyRoto website. He was named the Humanitarian of the Year by the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. He even earned an Ivy League degree in psychological and brain studies, which means I guess he's really, really smart. Drew also played tennis at a Division I school in the Ivy League, where he is the second all-time leader in wins. He worked for Morgan Stanley as an investment analyst, and get this, he has been featured in both Maxim and the Wall Street Journal. Wow. Quite the resume for the man they call Dinkpiece. Drew, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind intro.
Yeah, well, I know you've been on Adam Levitan's show, and he was on our show in episode 29, and I know that he likes to do some interesting introductions, so I can't quite light a candle to him, but I was at least motivated and inspired by him. You know, I think given that kind of rundown or kind of your limited bio or limited resume, I feel like I'm talking to the Dos Equis guy, you know, the most interesting man in the world. But other than that, why don't you fill us in on your background a little bit more, maybe fill in some gaps, give us a further snapshot into who Drew Dinkmeyer is.
Yeah, it's funny. I think you would be the only person to ever consider me even close to one of the most interesting people in the world if you talk to those people around me. I think my resume stands out on paper, but I'm a pretty bland personality when around friends and family and whatnot. But I would say, you know, most of the things you hit on there. I grew up playing tennis. I grew up in South Florida. My dad was my tennis coach, and so had a very, very close relationship with my dad. We were involved in everything together, playing tennis, playing fantasy sports, everything that I got interested in, he followed suit. And so grew up in South Florida, went to school at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. That was a little bit of an eye-opening experience for a kid from Florida who had never seen snow when he went to college to do college in Hanover, where it gets like -20 in the winters. And then got into finance out of school. I really didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea out of college. Spent a few years in finance, kind of found my footing in research in that area, doing research on investment managers for a consulting firm. And all the while had this huge passion for fantasy sports that kind of carried the day for me. From like the time I got up, I was thinking about sports. The time I went to bed, I was thinking about fantasy sports. And I kept trying to do things on the side, trying to carve out a potential career path in fantasy sports. But it wasn't until daily fantasy sports came around that I was able to make that a reality.
Well, you are a big sports fan. And obviously that's your job, that's your business. But we have other sports fans here, and there might even be one or two people that are Chicago Bears fans. And you're a Bears fan, and maybe the only hardcore people out there might even recognize the name Marquise Wilson. What does that name mean to you?
Man, Marquise Wilson, just, you know, one of the people that has changed my life in a substantial way. He was drafted by the Bears in like the 5th or 6th round, had a really great collegiate career at Washington State, and was a player that I was really excited when they drafted him, because as a freshman at Washington State, he had huge numbers, eventually ran into some off the field stuff where he was thrown off the team, and it hurt his draft stock quite a bit. But he was a player that, you know, from a profile perspective, when you look at his speed, his production at a young age, he looked like a really interesting wide receiver prospect. And he got an opportunity late in the 2014 season when, I forget if it was Brandon Marshall or Alshon Jeffrey, but one of those guys went down with an injury, and it opened up some playing time late in the season for him. And he was min price on Draftkings, and he ended up being the last piece that I needed to be able to take home Draftkings Millionaire Maker. And he scored his first touchdown of his career. It it was enough to kind of put me over the top and end up winning one of those first millionaire makers in the first year that Draftkings ran it. So he was a guy that I liked a lot as a draft prospect for the Bears. He couldn't really stay healthy, and he just never got many opportunities after that because his body kind of failed him. But he had a huge impact on my life because his first touchdown ended up being the difference for me between making $1 million in that tournament and making like $100,000 in that tournament.
So when people hear or think of the phrase "a game within the game," that's really one of those examples. It's a late December game. The Bears are getting blown out. I don't think they've even scored yet, and Marquise Wilson gets his first career touchdown, which will be the only touchdown that year, but it wins you $1 million essentially.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then you get all the, the notice and the notifications on Twitter and stuff that basically like this guy who's not making $1 million because he's in his rookie contract just made you $1 million in a year. It's a weird thing, the game within the game with fantasy sports and how big the prize pools have grown. And the fact that, in 2014, we had these contests with $1 million up top was kind of insane.
Well, how do you balance your allegiances or your preferences for certain sports teams or players with your fantasy sports profession?
I think it's interesting because a lot of people assume, you kind of work backwards in that you grow up as a sports fan of a team, and then those players you become individually connected to, and then you have biases kind of towards those players. And that certainly happens at the beginning. But once you start doing this more frequently, it kind of works the opposite way, where you develop projections and then you develop affinities for individual players that might not be on your favorite team. And you just have like affinities for those players. So a lot of my favorite players around the different leagues aren't necessarily on Chicago sports teams that I root for. Some of them certainly are, but it's definitely a different experience. I actually think for me personally, fantasy sports has like humanized the individual element a little bit more, that I root for players over franchises and organizations because franchises and organizations might bring in players that you don't particularly like, whether it's from an athletic perspective or whether it's from off the field choices that they've made or whatever it is. So I kind of like the freeing nature of daily fantasy sports where I get to, use or roster different players throughout the course of the season. It gives me an approach to kind of liking everyone around the league.
Now, I've gotten to know some professional coaches or professional athletes in my work as a leadership trainer, and I've ended up losing quite a bit of money on playing them in fantasy sports sometimes. I just can't get away from them. Is there one or two players that you just have a hard time getting away from, even though your head says you probably shouldn't play them?
There's not too many. More for me, the wrestling is when the numbers really like a player and my head is like, man, this player just hasn't looked right of late. And I'm sitting there staring at a projection advantage that's so strong. And I'm trying to kind of weigh that against what my eyes are telling me. Those are more of the instincts that I get into where my projections really like a player and I'm struggling with them. Like this MLB season, Giancarlo Stanton's kind of been that way where our projections have been really, really high on him moving from Miami to Yankee Stadium, which is a much smaller park, much better for home runs. And his home run rate's actually dropped. It's been a weird season. So there are times, but it's more kind of the reverse for me where the projections are guiding me in a direction that my eyes are telling me like, I'm not so sure about this. And sometimes you just keep kind of hammering at the projections until you feel like you're losing your mind a little bit.
Well, you grew up playing tennis. Did you have a particular favorite tennis player? Were you the jean shorts, Andre Agassi with the long hair?
I was not. I did have, I think if you grew up in that era, so I was born in 82. So, I grew up in the Sampras Agassi area. You definitely had, it was hard not to fall in love with Agassi's kind of approach off the court and his flash and like the neon ace face like gear that was running around when I was like 10 years old or whatever. But my favorite tennis players were two serve and volleyers, Stefan Edberg and Patrick Rafter. A Swede and an Australian, but I just loved the way serve and volleyers played. I grew up in Florida, which it's really tough to serve and volley in Florida because you play on a lot of clay courts. So the clay makes it a slower game on the whole, and it makes it much more difficult to be successful as a serve and volleyer. But I just love that style of play. I love that aggressive play, kind of taking into the net. I didn't have a big serve. I wasn't a big guy growing up, so I didn't love the guys who had just monstrous serves because I couldn't replicate that. But some of the other guys I could kind of replicate. So Rafter and Edberg were the two guys I grew up following.
Well, you mentioned that you Try to make sure that you choose the right players and don't get too emotional about that. We mentioned earlier that Adam Levitan was on our show in episode 29, and I heard him say that if he was gone for a year and had to have someone manage his fantasy accounts or his fantasy affairs, he would want to choose you because you're so trustworthy and consistent. And I loved it when he said you're not the type of guy that'll snorkel with models.
Yeah, he doesn't have to worry about me really going anywhere. This is what I love to do, and so I'm pretty diligent about the way that I approach things. It's very much from a mathematical perspective, but it's also trying to understand ranges of outcomes and where weaknesses might be in a projection model. And I talk with Adam a lot. We talk frequently, daily, in chats and stuff. So he has a good idea of kind of the way that I approach things, and I have a good idea about the way he approaches things. And I think I'm a little bit more of a mathematical background, where he's a little bit more of he's just relentless with hunting and gathering news and information. And the combination is really powerful. So I enjoy having him as a resource to be able to leverage when it comes to daily fantasy.
So a person can play fantasy sports or daily fantasy and not be a degenerate, not gamble on anything, and just be willy-nilly.
Yeah, I mean, you can. It's very difficult to do that. Even the best pros, I would say, many times during the course of the season are entering contests that either the structure of the contest or the sport they're playing themselves, their edge is not substantial, and thus they're closer to the gambling side of things. So, I mean, it's tough when you're consistently wagering large sums of money every single day of the year, not to run into some patterns of degeneracy for sure. But yeah, you can do it. It takes a very specific mentality and a very specific approach to be able to do that and not fall victim to the allures of the degeneracy.
So you would be much more of a Knish as opposed to Mike McDermott.
Yeah, I use that reference often. It's very funny because a lot of the people that I talk to, they play way higher stakes than me frequently. And they've talked to me at different times, like right after the Welly-Maker. I had a couple friends who said, you really should be playing higher stakes, especially in NBA. You're one of the better NBA DFS players at this time. You should really be upping the stakes. And I did that for a few weeks and I couldn't handle it. I was just an anxious mess. It was too much out on a given night for me. The swings were too big. And so I just said, guys, I'm going back to my bread route. Like I'm just going back to my bread route. I'm playing like the stakes that I can do. I'm going to grind my bread route. I'm good with that. I'll occasionally hit something that's big and it'll be life changing. And that's kind of how I'll work through things. But yeah, I use that reference often.
So kind of piggybacking on that, if someone's out there, the NFL season is starting, it's right around the corner. And if somebody wants to get into daily fantasy sports on Draftkings or FanDuel, something like that, what kind of advice would you have for somebody that just kind of wants to dabble in it?
I think the first thing that I'd say is identify your goals and identify your bankroll. So, it's fine if your goals are, hey, I just want to have fun and I want to play in a tournament that if I get everything right, I have the ability to change my life. Like, the FanDuel Sunday Million or the Draftkings Millionaire Maker, any one of those. That's totally a fine approach. Most people that are playing daily fantasy sports should be doing it for entertainment purposes. But you then need to identify your bankroll. How much are you willing to lose during the course of the season and put that in play? And then kind of, manage that and allocate that over the course of the season. I would say in general, you probably want to allocate your resources a little bit earlier in the season because the sites sometimes have overlay in the first week as they, have bigger marketing budgets and they try to run big tournaments. Also early in the season, I think early in the season, the pros are at less of an advantage than they are later in the season when they have more data, just because the more data you have, the more understanding you have of how to model the game without knowing like new pieces and how they're adjusting in different things. At least that's what it's been for me. Most of my big hits have all been late in the season. But I would say identify your goals and identify your bankroll are the two by far most important things, because at least if you go in with a plan, you know what you're trying to get out of the experience. For some people, that's going to be purely entertainment. For some people, it's going to be trying to grind, $1,000 up to $2,000 by the end of the season. And you're going to take different tasks and enter different contests based on what your goals are.
Well, you actually had a huge influence on me getting into daily fantasy. I was one of these, the typical story. I was in season long forever. And then all of a sudden, every time I'm looking at my TV, The stinking commercials are coming on from Draftkings that have real people, they say, winning real money or whatever. And you're one of those. And I think, 1 week right there before football season in 2015, Draftkings was like the third or fourth most prevalent TV ad, right up there with the ATTs and those kind of things. So you were all over the place, influencing me to get into DFS, and I'm not broke yet. So I guess I followed some of that advice about bankroll.
Yeah, those commercials, you could not get away from them. And from my perspective, I don't know. I think there was more bad than good that came out of that in the end, because I think it ramped up a lot of the legal questions around the industry and the growth area. And for me personally, it's not like anybody outside of the people that I know already are recognizing me in commercials, or, I'm not even on the streets. I just stay at home all day. So it's not like people are seeing me out anyway. So there's no real exposure benefits there. But yeah, the commercial bombardment was, I was mostly getting texts from friends that are like, could you please get off my TV screen? Like, I'm really tired of seeing you. And I was like, yeah, trust me, I'm just as tired of it.
Well, you were featured in Maxim, but
yeah,
not the way most of us would want to be featured in it.
Yeah, also
normal story.
Yeah, that was the other thing about kind of having some success in the industry is when the industry came under scrutiny. They were looking for anybody who had had any sort of tie to the industry to then rope into articles. Some of those articles, the interviewers had, I would say, more integrity with the questions and the follow-ups, and some, like, you would just, I would get messages that, hey, you've been named in this New York Times article. And I was like, I haven't spoken to anybody at the New York Times. Like, why is my name in this article? So yeah, the exposure and when the industry came under a lot of scrutiny could also be very frustrating.
We'll return to our conversation with Drew Dinkmeyer in just a moment. For Drew to be a highly successful fantasy sports player, it's important that he sticks to the fundamentals and trusts his process. Whether we're talking about sports, business, life, or fantasy sports, certain qualities are needed to maximize your potential and reach the success that you want. Our book, Building Champions: Success Principles from A to Z, contains practical stories and insights on 26 key qualities. To find out more about this impactful book, please visit buildingchampionsthebook.com. And now, back to our interview with Drew Dinkmeyer. Well, a lot of our listeners do play in at least some season-long fantasy contests, maybe just friendlies with their friends in the neighborhood or whatever. Do you have any inside information? Do you have somebody that you think is someone that's flying under the radar that can that's a sleeper that can help them get to their playoffs, or somebody that they should probably avoid that's really overrated?
Yeah, so I would say for me, it's more about price on players. So for me, the players that I feel like are really undervalued early in draft season, or I guess it's late in draft season now, but I feel like because Mike Williams, the rookie that the Chargers drafted last year, is going in like the 9th or 10th round in a lot of drafts that I'm in, I think that's way overvalued. And I'm much more likely to pick up Tyrell Williams, who has actually been a successful player on the field and consistently a successful player on the field in the 13th or 14th round. And with Hunter Henry out, the Chargers having a better offensive line this year, there should be more end zone targets and opportunities. And so I find Tyrell Williams to be one of the better values in draft season. And then I would say I'm always like a wait on quarterback guy in general, but I think Ben Roethlisberger this year, he's going around like quarterback 10 or so, quarterback 7 through 10. And I think he's going to be a top 5 quarterback this year with all the weapons they have, adding in James Washington, hopefully a fully healthy year from Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell. I think Ben Roethlisberger is a little bit undervalued early in the season as well.
And that's a great point, Drew. A lot of times you can wait and get a good quarterback late. You don't have to go up and shoot for the stars on your quarterback.
Yeah. A lot of people like to take quarterbacks early because, they project for the highest amount of points, but the range and difference of outcomes between quarterbacks is fairly small. And then I know I mentioned kind of Mike Williams as a player that I don't like at his current price, but I would say almost all the Seahawks as well. I think this could be a really tough year for the Seahawks. And I think outside of Russell Wilson, you've got Doug Baldwin, who already said he's at best 80 to 85% all year. If they get off to a tough start this year, you could see Doug Baldwin's season kind of come to an early end if he feels like he's trying to gut through an injury. The offensive line struggles they had last year. Obviously, they drafted a running back early, so they didn't really add to the depth of the team in terms of the areas that really matter. So I'm low on the Seahawks. I have no Russell Wilson this year, who I'm a huge fan of. I think he alone is the only reason for optimism around that team. But I'm really light on the Seahawks, which a lot of Seahawks fans like to hit me on Twitter about.
We mentioned you were Humanitarian of the Year by the Fantasy Sports Trade Association last year, and that was for your work with helping get clean water to underprivileged communities. And you have a great name for that, called the Welly-Maker. How did you come up with the idea for the Welly-Maker, and tell our listeners what that's all about?
Yeah, so I was listening to a podcast with Bill Simmons a few years ago, and he had this guy on, Scott Harrison. I knew nothing about him. He was, the description said he was CEO of and founder of a charity organization called Charity Water. And I had listened to this podcast with really no expectation whatsoever. It was just, hey, Bill Simmons got a new podcast out. I'll listen to this. And it was a podcast that really changed my perspective on a lot of things. It was the most inspirational hour I've ever listened to. And it basically outlined that, this is a huge problem around the world. That's the source of so many of the other problems, malnutrition and disease, is the fact that people just don't have access to clean water, and people are spending tons of time just trying to get water, and the water that they're getting isn't even particularly clean or healthy, and it leads to all these other challenges. And it just struck me as one, the founder's, Scott Harrison's, life story was very similar to mine, in that what he was doing with his initial career, he was successful in, but it was something that wasn't ultimately helping the world. It was something that was helping other people of wealth have entertainment and enjoyment, but it wasn't really doing anything to, help better humanity or move humanity forward. So the message from the founder spoke to me, and then the message of the charity: 100% of your donations going directly to the water projects, transparency, all of their overhead funding, all the staff and everything is funded by outside donors. So they have two separate funds that everything goes to. So and you get followed up with on how your donations are impacting people. So I started making donations pretty much right after hearing that podcast. My wife and I were inspired to start contributing, and the follow-up from Charity Water was great. We knew exactly where the donations were going to. We knew who we were impacting. And I thought, there's so much in the fantasy community. I saw Scott Fish have so much success with the Fishbowl, with the leagues that they run that raises money for Toys for Tots. I saw in the poker community, which there's large overlap with the DFS community as well. Dan Smith had run this huge charity drive where I think they raised over $1 million, and they gave to a bunch of different causes. And I saw him, and I'm dealing with people who you might not think, because they have excess funds that they're able to play with in DFS. You might not necessarily think in a game that everybody's playing to try to take each other's money that people have kind of this big heart to them. But I saw it in these two other examples, so I decided, hey, why don't I take this idea of this great charity and this great cause and see if I can leverage kind of my platform to help raise awareness and raise some money for it. And so I was trying to think about the best ways to go about doing that. And the thing that kind of hit me was that, I won a Draftkings Millionaire Maker, and that changed my life. And so it was, a $20 entry, or at the time 27 or whatever it was. And that totally changed my life. And every week, as we sit down and play our DFS lineups, people are trying to do that. They're trying to put in an entry that can change their life. And for the cost of that entry, Charity Water estimates about $30 will give someone clean water for the rest of their life. And so for somewhat similar cost to that one entry, you can guarantee changing someone else's life, as opposed to taking one more chance at trying to change yours. If you're taking those chances, you probably already have a lot of resources available to you. And I felt like that message, the idea that instead of taking, just take one less chance at trying to change your life and guarantee changing someone else's life, would really be impactful. And then that became the idea of, instead of a Millie-Maker, we could have a Welly-Maker, where, the campaign donations and contributions would go to clean, sustainable water solutions, which are often drilled wells.
Well, it made me start to think when I first heard about it and when you put it the way that you did, because I was like, how many times, does your lineups have to be in at 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning, and 2 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock at night, you're throwing in an extra entry or an extra 2 entries just because you're bored or you want to have one more chance at it. And I'm like, hey, if you're just doing that, you might as well give it to something that's more worthwhile.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that for myself as well. And this cause, to me, it's at the root of so many of the challenges that people just, if you can't have access to clean water, it's just a really big upward battle in terms of trying to move forward in society. And so this is a cause that I got behind. I think the message is impactful, and I think any of the Charity Water's done a ton of videos and a ton of podcasts where Scott Harrison's gone around talking about the cause and the mission, and I listen to everything I can from them because it's so inspiring to me. But it's at the root of everything. Like we just take it for granted in the U.S. I know it's becoming more of an issue in the U.S. now with Flint and some areas in the Appalachians and different things where access to clean drinking water is becoming more of a challenge than it has been in the past. But we still have bottled water and stuff available that people can buy at stores, or governments can help give out. These rural areas in India, Africa, they just have no access. So they're sharing drinking spots with animals and whatnot as their water sources. It's very difficult. And when you see the level of clarity that they're drinking the water with, you would never consider drinking that type of water in the U.S. And it's all they have.
Well, and if you want to get involved as a listener, and it's really easy, you can go to Drew's Twitter page at Drew Dinkmeyer. And it's there. You can check that out. We'll also have all the stuff in the show notes, but it's really easy, whether you have a ton of disposable income or only $5 or $10 that you can give, because like Drew said, $30 essentially provides water for a lifetime for somebody. So any little bit that you give is actually a huge part in their lives. And what were your results last year, Drew?
Yeah, last year we raised just over $40,000, and it was unbelievable to me. I came with the idea of, hey, let's try to raise $10,000 and I'll match $10,000. And because Charity Water estimates that the average cost of a water project is about $10,000. So my idea was, hey, if I can get the community to help raise $10,000, I'll match $10,000. We have 2 fully funded water projects. And I think we hit the first 10,000 in a few days. So I was overwhelmed by the generosity of the community. It was awesome. And so we ended up raising $40,000 in total. We had some different match targets along the way. So this year, my wife and I decided, hey, it would be great if we could grow this in a substantial way. And last year we raised $40,000. We're going to match the first $40,000 in donations. So our goal is to help, grow this at a multiple. Last year, the $40,000 raised is an estimate of delivering clean drinking water to over 1,300 people. So, if we can knock out another 2,000, 2,500 people of the 660 million people that don't have access to clean drinking water around the world, we can keep making a dent in this. And Charity Water's already made a huge dent with millions of people that have now had access to clean water. And this is something that can be cured in our lifetimes. And it's something that just gives everybody a better opportunity to live a healthier and longer life.
Well, and as you throw out those numbers, it can seem kind of overwhelming. And it's like, wow, so many people need this and don't have this. How can I possibly help? But really, any little bit helps, because, you might not be able to help everybody, but you can help somebody, and you might not be able to do everything, but you can do something. And so, this is a great opportunity, whether you play fantasy sports or not, a great way to give. And why don't you give that website again, if you would, and let our listeners know how they can get involved a little bit in this cause.
Yeah, charitywater.org is the website. If you want more information on my specific campaign, if you Google Welly-Maker 2.0, that'll take you right to the link. But also on my Twitter page, my pinned tweet has a link directly to the campaign where you can donate, or if you want more information, we have on our site, DailyRoto.com/Welly-Maker, all of the information and the reasons that I got into this, the link to the Bill Simmons podcast, a video kind of explaining my passion for this topic, a recap of the the campaign last year where we raised $40,000, how that money is now being put to work in Mozambique and some of the updates we've gotten from Charity Water there. This year's campaign, the funds are going to go to Mali, which is another area that they've started investing in terms of clean water. So any of those ways, my Twitter page, dailyroto.com/Welly-Maker, or if you just Google Welly-Maker 2.0, you'll get taken right to the donate page.
And speaking of your webpage, some of our listeners are fantasy football players, and you have a website. How can that website help them out and help them maybe get an edge on their friends or people that they play against?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that we have available in our NFL premium product. So the first and most important thing, I think, is the projections. These are the projections that myself, Mike Leone, who's my co-founder, we use week in and week out when we're building our lineups. We also have an optimizer that helps build lineups and has lots of different rules and tools that you can set up to help, create correlation in your lineups or make sure that your lineups are built and constructed in a thoughtful manner. Those are two right off the bat. But then alongside that, we have podcasts that we do during the course of the week where we kind of try to educate, our subscribers on what the slate looks like to us, what look like the highest probability plays, but also what look like the highest upside plays. Within our projections, we have ranges of outcomes for every player. So you can see what a player's 5th percentile performance would be versus their 90th percentile performance, which just helps you understand which players might have higher ceilings and which players might have higher floors. That's important to use when you're thinking about, what kind of contest you're in. If you're in a tournament where the top prize is really heavily weighted towards the top 1% of finishers, you want to take players with higher upsides. If you're in a contest where you're playing like a head-to-head or, the top 50% of people cash in the contest, you want higher floors. So we try to kind of take you through a course of a week, all the stuff that we use in our own builds and our own plays with our projections, with the optimizer, with a podcast kind of highlighting what we think about the slate. And then all of our stuff, all of our projections are customizable too. So if you have differences of opinions from us, you can actually change things on our projections to make it so that it kind of comes through in the optimizer. So we've got a lot of cool things available at DailyRoto that can help from, a new age DFS player to an experienced and advanced DFS player.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you rarely leave the house. What if you were to leave the house? Is there a sporting event or something you'd love to go to that maybe is on your bucket list?
Yeah, so I grew up playing tennis. Wimbledon has always kind of been on the bucket list for me. And then outside of that, I would like to sit courtside at an NBA game. I love the NBA. It's my favorite sport. It's my favorite league. I've had good seats, but I haven't sat courtside anywhere yet. So like courtside for, a pretty high profile game or some high profile players would be just a very unique experience. So those are the two things that kind of stand out to me as, bucket list type sporting events.
So not the Chicago Bulls.
No, not the Bulls right now. If I could go back in time to the Bulls of my youth with Jordan and Pippen and Horace Grant or Rodman and Kukoc, yeah, I would love that. But the Bulls now, they mostly just drive me insane. Because I grew up they were the team that gave me so much positive feedback as a young kid, thanks to Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. And now their management does things that are just very different from what analytics people would suggest. And so it's a very difficult struggle for me as a Bulls fan to watch the front office do things that, from a probability perspective, make very little sense.
Well, he's Drew Dinkmeyer. And on Twitter, you can follow him at Drew Dinkmeyer, and we'll have all the links in the show notes, and definitely encourage you to follow him. Drew, appreciate your time today. Good luck this year in the fantasy football DFS competitions.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you for having me.
I could talk to Drew for hours about sports. We might watch ESPN personalities and talking heads break down games, but the professional daily fantasy sports players that compete at the highest levels with thousands of dollars on the line each night, they really know their stuff. They can break down the games and players with precision. But as much as Drew knows and has been successful, what he is doing with Charity Water is even more impressive. He and his wife are generously matching, all giving up to $40,000 for the Welly-Maker 2.0. So please take just a quick few moments to check out his pinned tweet at Drew Dinkmeyer. It takes no time at all to donate $5, $10, or even $30 to this cause and guarantee to change a life. Thanks so much, and until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?